that's what they identify. I do want to bring your attention to the school improvement grant portion on this slide. That is because this is going to be delayed till January, and Dr. Stevenson said maybe February of 2010. And I want to momentarily, I'll talk about that school improvement grant because I think it's real illustrative of what's happening with the Recovery Act, what's happening with ESEA reauthorization, and how this also ties into the fiscal urgency to get something done and soon. And then there's the final category is competitive increases, and those are listed there for you. Now, when the Department of Education publishes information, it's in the public domain. So I've cribbed this from Dr. Stevenson's presentation because I also want to lay out these programs over time. And this slide does a good job of doing that. On your slide, if you look at the top, it's fairly hard to read, but it says summer, fall, and winter. And the key to this slide is to understand that all these programs, the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund, the Race to the Top, the School Improvement, all of these, first of all, create a good amount of work for you. I mean, we have been slammed trying to catch up, to understand, to implement, disseminate. All this has been a tremendous amount of work. But also, this is all incremental. And when you work on any one of these programs, you are working on all of these programs. And that is a theme that you should also keep in mind when doing your work. None of this is siloed. I think Dr. Stevenson made that point, but because I don't work for the Department of Education, I can make points with a little more fuerte, a little stronger, in a more offensive manner, but everything here is tied together. And nothing should be in silos. I mean, practically there are some silos we're still working through, but the idea of the Department of Education, kind of a new federal theory of action, is to break that down and focus everything around the 4 core priority reform areas. So let's, on your next slide, I think I could spend a lot of time going program by program and pointing out some of the interesting parts of it. Let's not do that. I'm sure you are going to do that over the next few days. But I want to take a little bit of time to look at the school improvement grants and the Recovery Act and illustrate how it works with the Recovery Act and illustrate what this means for ESEA reauthorization to make the point that these are all closely connected. And I argue that the school improvement grant here is the absolute most critical of all the programs that come along. That it is subsequent to the state fiscal stabilization, subsequent to the Race to the Top, because of its unique nature. And I'll talk about that as I go along. I think it's worth examining because there are some great insights in the role it plays into the Recovery Act and how it builds upon what's required of the state fiscal stabilization, how it builds upon what's required of the Race to the Top. But it's also critical to future requirements and what is going to happen with the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, because they really prescribe some very technical new approaches that address some of the major flaws of the current law. And so this begins to give us a sense of where the department is going with reauthorization. So on the next slide, gives you a little background on what they have proposed. Now, how many people are familiar with the School Improvement Grant Fund? Raise of hands. Kind of leveled, all right, so maybe 5–10%. Maybe it's about 5 to 10% of the room are familiar with it. I would argue that you should take some time and read this, because this is going to be a central part of what happens going forward. So what have they proposed? Well, for a quick background, what this program does is broken off into 2 parts, an A and a G. The A allows you to use 4% of your Title I Part A to serve LEAs with the greatest need and strongest commitment to school turnaround. And currently, the state has discretion by what do you mean by greatest need and strongest commitment in distributing the funds to LEAs. The G part adds to that grant. It adds the 4% for LEAs with the greatest need and strongest commitment. And then there are some more parameters on how that money is distributed. The proposed requirements take that discretion away. They begin to be much more prescriptive about what needs to be done for school turnaround. And if you look at bullet 2 here, they begin to define greatest need and strongest commitment. And by greatest need, they are now devising a 3-tiered program, which Tier 1 are the schools in the lowest 5% of all Title I schools, or the lowest 5 or the 5 lowest achieving Title I school, whichever is the greatest. Tier 2, this gets a little tricky. These are secondary schools, middle high schools that are equally as low achieving as Tier 1 and are eligible for but do not receive Title I funds currently. And Tier 3 is the general catch-all category. It's all other schools that are in corrective action, restructuring, that are not in Tier 1. So we see they really begin to narrow down the definition of what they want out of greatest needs. Likewise, the strongest commitment is being defined down. And this is really, they want to define this to include 4 specific models: a turnaround model, a restart model, a school closure model, and a transformational model. There would be a little, and these would be required in Tier 1 and 2. There would be proposed more flexibility in Tier 3 schools. But you see how they're beginning to really narrow down what must be done and how this begins to tie into what No Child Left Behind requires currently. So ARA and ESCA obviously working around the same principles. You don't have, I don't think you have this slide in front of you here, but this begins to flesh out what is required on these 4 models. Turnaround model, for example, you don't have it in the upper left-hand corner, but it says replacing the principal and at least 50% of the staff adopting new governance and implementing new programs. So fairly significant, fairly rigorous intervention. The restart model is to close the school and open it under a management of a charter school operator. Not going to happen here. Educational management organization. So closing it down, putting it into a management specialist organization. Closing the consolidate model, this would be really just closing down the schools and putting the students into LEAs, into higher performing schools, into LEA. And then even more detailed is the transformation model. And this deals with teacher and leader effectiveness programs, professional development, comprehensive instructional programs, extended learning time, and flexibility and intensive support, a lot of management-focused issues. And then the proposals goes down and really gets into significant details on this transformation model. So pages on what is required. So it's fairly prescriptive. All this is very expansive. However, Title I fiscal requirements are not that expansive. So the department has been very careful in trying to describe how this can be used. It has some very unique flexibility that's part of this school improvement grant, including the requirement to seek waivers. So if you're going to do school-wide intervention, replacing students, that'd be easier to replace the students, then you could always bring in the best ones. Replacing the principals and replacing staff, you really can't do that with Title I funds. I mean, that's not supplemental. So it would have to be done in a school-wide setting. And so there are flexibility waivers provision that would allow schools to be school-wide in order to use these interventions. It's technical, it's complex, and it's certainly ambitious. 2 items I would want to point out on this slide is that the flexibility in the school improvement grant is very unique, including in the first, I don't know if you can see this, but it says for the restart model, there would be a waiver so the school could start over on the AYP process. So if it were to choose a restart model, you get the waiver on the AYP process. That means you don't have to provide choice in SES. You're off the hook for that if you do the restart model. Also, some flexibility, as I mentioned, around enabling Tier 1 schools that are operating targeted assistance programs to operate as school-wide programs for the purposes of this type of intervention. So it would be some type of ARA intervention school-wide that would waive a lot of the requirements of current school-wide planning. It's certainly going to be a challenge. So that's the background on some significant challenges, significant, I think, innovations and opportunities or significant proposals for the school improvement grant. It's certainly going to be complex. It's certainly going to be technical. And I think it's important to recognize how this program